Hi and welcome to this tutorial. When we were learning servlets, we learned about request, session, and context objects. So in this tutorial, we'll try to understand how they map to using these objects inside JSPs. Since we learned that JSPs are nothing but servlets actually, and Tomcat is actually converting JSPs into servlets behind the scenes, all these concepts that we used in servlets should automatically translate to JSPs. Well, they do, but there are a few, there's a difference in the way we actually access those objects. So we'll try to understand what that difference is and how we actually use those objects inside JSPs. So let me create a new JSP page. I'll call these this objects.jsp. Now, what I want to do here is to take the request object and we'll have the user pass a parameter and we'll print the parameter here. This will be similar to what we did in the servlets tutorial. So the code is more or less similar, but the way we access the objects is different. Say, for example, if you had to use a request object inside a servlet, how would you do it? A request object is passed as a parameter to our doGet or a doPost method. So we would just take that parameter and we would use that object. So in the case of JSP, now say I write some code here to access the request object. We know that the code in between these two tags are going to go inside a service method, which will be called for a doGet or a doPost. Now, I can actually access the request object by just using request here. Now, JSP has this implicit object called request, which has been predefined. So all I do is I just do a request.get parameter, and I can get the request object and I can get the parameter from the request object. So it is available. All I have to do is use the request word. So same as before, I'll try to capture the main parameter, but this time inside a JSP. And I will assign it to a string variable, and now I can print name. That's it. Now if I run this, I should be able to capture the name parameter that's passed to this JSP and then print that in the JSP output itself. Initially it will be null because I'm not passing anything here. Say name equals text to user, and text to user gets displayed. Okay, now that we have the request object, getting the session object should be fairly straightforward. Now I just use a request dot get session. There's this method I can get a session object, but I don't actually have to do that. Just like we have an implicit request object, we also have an implicit session and context object available in the JSP. In order to use the implicit session object, just like request, I have to use the session word dot get attribute. This will work because just like the request object, we also have the session object available to us in the JSP. So just like the session object, we can also get the context object, but it's not actually called context. The implicit object here is called application. So I can use application to get the context object, and I can do a dot get attribute here, and then I can get the context object's get attribute. So these are the implicit objects available here. We have request, we have session, and we have application for the request object, session object, and the application object. So in a servlet, we would get the request object from the parameter and then get the session and the application object from the request object. But in the case of the JSP, we would not need to do that. We have these implicit objects and we can use them in time. Okay, now I've written some code here which does something very similar to what we did in our servlets tutorial. So I get the request parameter called name, I get the value, into a string. And then I check if that is not null. I set that to the session as well as to the application context object. Now I just print these out. So if I'm passing the value name, the value for the parameter name, then it gets set into the the request, the session, and the application object. And if I'm not passing the parameter, then it will just show the value as it is. So now let me save and run this just to make sure that works fine. If everything is null initially because I'm not passing anything. Now let's say I pass a name equals test user. Now everything is set to test user. If I remove this and I do not pass it next time, the request object will not have a value, but the session and the application context object should have the value that we have passed. Now, yes, it still does that. Now let's test this on an external browser as well to make sure that the application context is also available. Well, there you go. It's a new session and we're not passing anything to the request, so these two are null, but the application context has been set in our first call to the application, and then this is available across different sessions. So what we have done here is similar to what we did in Servlets, but the way we access these objects are different. We just use the object, implicit objects that JSP provides for us, request for the request object, session for the session object, and application for the application context object. In addition to these three objects which have these three scopes, there is an additional object which is applicable only to JSPs, and that is called the PageContext object. This does not have an equivalent in Servlets. We have seen the equivalent of request, session, and context, but the PageContext that we have in JSPs does not have an equivalent in the Servlets. There are a couple of usages of the PageContext object. One of them is something that we'll look at a bit later in the later tutorials. But one use of the PageContext object is something we'll see now. In order to access the PageContext object, we use something similar to what we're doing for the the request, session, and application here. We just say PageContext. So this will give us the PageContext object. So I can do a PageContext dot set attribute, and this will set the attribute in the same way as it sets an attribute for a session or an application. I can use a string PageContext username, and I will pass the same username value, and let me put this inside the if as well. And I will add a print statement. So I'm going to get the PageContext value here. So this will be PageContext. So this is how we access the PageContext object, and I will pass the same string that we passed there. So it's like another scope here. Just like you're setting the session attribute and the application context attribute, we're also setting the page context attribute, and then we're getting this printed over here. So let's save and run this. Okay, I've not restarted, so the session, the application context will still be available and the session context is available, but page context is not. Let's pass a value, new test user. Now all these objects have the new test user. There is one other thing that the page context object does that's handy, and we can use that if required. The page context object has an overloaded implementation of the set attribute and the get attribute methods. So there is a way for, by using the page context object, you can set attributes in the session scope, you can set attributes in the application scope by using the page context object and not using these two objects. We'll have a look at how that's happening. Now I can use the page context object dot set attribute. You see this, there is one more method here which takes three parameters: the string, the object, and an integer. So we'll use that method here. So I will say application username. Let's comment this out. So I'm not going to use the application object. I will use this object. So I'll set the application context here using the page context object. So I will pass the username here, and I will pass an enumeration page context dot application scope. Now what's happening here? In order to set an attribute in the application scope, there are two ways in which you can set that attribute. One is by using the application object. We've already seen that, and use a set attribute, it's going to set it to the application context. There is another way to do that using the page context. So I use the page context.set attribute only, but I use another method definition which expects you to pass the scope as well. Now this is the third parameter to the set attribute method. It's an integer, and you can use the page context, this value defined in the page context class, which is the application scope. Now if I pass the application scope to the set attribute, it's going to set this value as this parameter as this value, and it's going to set it in the application scope. Now if I want to set another string as a session scope, then all I do is I use the page context dot session scope here. Now if I want to set a request scope, then I use the request scope. So what's happening here is, instead of using different objects to set different scopes, I can use only one object, which is the page context, and I use the same set attribute signature, but the third parameter here I can use to set the scope itself. Now I can use this set attribute method to set an object in the application scope, or I can set it in the session scope, or I can set it in the request scope by passing that parameter here. Now these are the scopes that are available. I have the application scope, the page scope, which is the default. If you're not passing this value, we've seen that happen over here, page context.set attribute. I just use those two parameters, and what's happening is it's actually setting it to the page scope. Now I can also specify this explicitly, and it sets it in the page scope, but I don't need to do that. But I can use these values, the application scope, the request scope, and the session scope, to set it in the corresponding scopes. So while this is a handy feature of the page context object, it does not really add any value. Whatever you do here using the set attribute and passing the scopes can be done using the corresponding scope objects as well. There's one other feature of the page context which will be handy sometimes, which is the find feature. So I can call this find attribute method of the page context. What this does is, if you pass a string here called name, for example, it finds the scope where the value is set for this attribute. Say for example, you have captured the name attribute, and you don't know whether it's in the request scope or the session scope or the application scope, for example. Now, in order to find out which scope it is, first you need to get from the request object, check if the value is null, and if it is null, then get it from the session object, then from the application object, and so on. The find attribute method is something that does that job for you. So the first thing it does is it checks if there is an attribute in the page context with the name that we pass here. Now, if it's not there, then it's going to look at the request object for that attribute. If it does not find it there, then it's going to look for the session object. And if it does not find it there, it's going to look for the application context object. So if any one of these objects have the value for this attribute that you're passing here, this find attribute method is going to return that value. And if none of these objects have that value, only then it's going to return a null string. So this find attribute method is very handy if you need to get an attribute and you don't know the scope, whether it's a request, a session, or an application, or the page context itself.